Tom Crouch is with us, speaking to us from West Virginia. He's already been out on his bike today. He volunteering on the Chesapeake and Ohio towpath, picking up trash. So he's already done 40 miles on his bike, but he's graciously offered to share his phenomenal slides and stories with us. So please welcome Dr. Tom Crouch. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bob, and everybody who's attending the webinar this afternoon. It's a real treat to be able to talk about Wilbur and Orville whenever I get a chance. So it's especially nice to talk to this group because I can sort of focus on cycling. I think everybody knows that Wilbur and Orville were not only cyclists, they operated a bike shop, so doing bike repairs and eventually selling bikes and eventually building bikes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And more important, we'll talk about why that played an important role in the invention of the airplane, which is the reason we generally talk about them anyway. So here they are. Wilbur, as you can see on the left, Orville on the right. Wilbur was almost 4 years older than Orville. They actually had a pair of twins who didn't survive infancy in between them. But there they are, the brothers themselves. Their mother and father, Susan Catherine Corner Wright, and their father, Bishop Milton Wright. Susan was a second generation American. Her parents had immigrated from Germany. And the bishop, on the other hand, came from a family that went back to the 17th century in this country. So an important part of shaping them. I guess families always shape who we are and what we do and how we do it. But the Wrights were extraordinarily close-knit as a family, and that played an important part in who they were. The bishop on the right was literally a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, and rose to become a national leader in the church. In fact, he was the bishop for the West Coast at one point. So traveling all the way back and forth across the continent in the middle of the 19th century when that was a tough thing to do, or going around the Horn in a schooner to get to California, which he also did. And their mother was extraordinary as well. The bishop was one of those guys who I guess could give a great sermon, but he couldn't pound the nail straight. Their mother was really the mechanic of the family, helped the kids make their toys, fixed things when they were broken in the house. And so they get skills, intellectual and mechanical, from both of their parents. There were actually 4 Wright brothers and 1 Wright sister. Ruchlin on the left is their oldest brother. Lauren in the middle, their middle brother, and Kate on the right is the youngest member of the family. It's Ruchlin, Lauren, then Wilbur, Orville, and then Kate. This is the home where they spent a lot of growing up years. Because the father was a bishop and traveled a lot, they traveled a lot too. But this house at number 7 Hawthorne Street in Dayton, Ohio, on the west side of Dayton, is the house that they always thought of as home. On the right, you can see kind of an oblique view of it. And on the left, it's that house with the porch that's on the right side of that image. This is where the house is today. It's the house in which they grew up is actually in Henry Ford's Greenfield Village today. But the good people of Dayton have kind of recreated the porch so that when you go to 7 Hawthorne today, at least you can see where the house used to be. And as you look at the other houses, you get the sense that that neighborhood, in fact, is not entirely different than what it was like when the Wrights were growing up. When they were youngsters, when people asked them how they became interested in the airplane, they would always tell the story about that little helicopter toy that you see in the center of the screen. Their father, coming back from California on one of those trips, would always bring toys and that kind of thing. And he was the kind of dad who liked to encourage curiosity. So they were often toys like this one, mechanical or interesting toys. When you wind up the little propeller on the very top, and you can see the bow helps give the thing force, and the rubber strands. When you wind it up and let it go, it bounces up against the ceiling. And in later years, when people would ask the Wrights how they became interested in the first place, they'd always talk about having a father who was wise enough to give them toys that were going to fascinate them and inspire them, and talk about the little helicopter toy. This is, as you can see, Central High, and the figure in the absolute middle of the screen, in the back row, is Orville Wright. His brother was older and already out of school. But interestingly enough, if you look at the African-American kid to the left over here with the hat on, that's Paul Laurence Dunbar, the African-American poet who was a classmate of Orv's and one of his best friends. They wound up giving Dunbar a bike and that kind of thing. So an interesting town at the time, and an interesting class. Picture the 10 Dayton boys, the guy in the middle in the back row. And this one, as you might tell, is Wilbur Wright. And you can see his brother, Rushlin, and that's Lauren on the far right. Just a boys' club. Orville was always fascinated by printing presses. He designed and built a fairly famous press when he was really quite young. And the first business that the brothers had was a little job printing shop, printing envelopes and calling cards. And they, as part of the operation, printed a couple of what we would regard as shopping newspapers today. You can see the Midget, which was a weekly, and led to West Side News, which was actually a daily. And the guy in the picture is neither one of them. It's a fellow named Ed Sines, who actually bought the printing operation in Dayton. When you go to Dayton today, you'll want to visit Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park in West Dayton. And it's in a multi-story big building that the print shop was in, and you can visit the print shop today and see how that worked. In the early 1890s, of course, the bicycle craze was sweeping America, and it swept Wilbur and Orville right along with it. They were members of the League of American Wheelmen. Orville, at least, was known as a scorcher, quote unquote, a bike racer who did pretty well. They both own rather expensive bikes. Orville bought in 1892 a Columbia Special Safety, which actually ran about $160. And if you think about that in 2022 dollars, that's a lot of money. Orville Wilbur, who was more frugal, I guess, had an $80 bike, but they loved to get out and do road rides and race as well, but road rides especially. They went from that. I mean, they still had the printing operation going, but they had kind of turned that over to their friend Ed Sine. And in 1892, they established their first bike shop. If you look at the pictures over here on your right, The picture at the bottom of the building with the two big windows and the two small windows in the second story, that's the bike shop they were in on West 3rd Street in 1903 when they flew the first airplane. The bike shop on top is a building that's still there today, and it's part of Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historic Park. So you can visit the only Wright bicycle shop that still stands on its original ground. The 1903 bike shop is like the house at Henry Ford Museum today, but the house at 22 South Williams, the bike shop is still there. And you can see some of their advertisements, especially for the Van Cleve. John Van Cleve and Benjamin Van Cleve were founders of Dayton and related to the Wright brothers. So they used the Van Cleve name as the names for their cycles. You can see down here, there's a St. Clair bike as well. Again, it's a tip of the hat to local history. Arthur St. Clair was a famous general operating in Ohio. So here's one of their catalogs. You can see they were very proud down here lower left of their self-oiling bike hub. They claimed that only once a year did you have to put some grease into the hub, and except for that, it was fine to just keep going. Once they began building bikes in 1894, they were very, very proud of the bikes they were producing, and you can see some of their literature there. This is the picture of Wilbur in the bike shop on South William Street, the one that's still in Dayton today. And you get some notion of what the bike shop looked like. You can see a drill press over here and part of a bike frame up there, and Orville's working on the lathe there. They had built a little one-lung single cylinder internal combustion engine that drove all of the machinery in the shop using line shafts and belts. You can see the belt that's driving the lathe that Orville's working on, and the drill press here, you can see that. Here's another picture of the inside of the bike shop. This is Wilbur Wright over here on the left. And again, that's Ed Sines, their buddy, working at the bench on the right. But you can see bike frames down here and get some notion of what the inside of that bike shop was like. You always have to remember that I once calculated that I thought the Wrights probably had the 14th largest bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton was a major bicycle town and remained so for many, many, many years. Huffy bicycles, of course, were all manufactured in Dayton. So this operation that the Wright brothers had was fairly small. The bikes they built were one-off bikes, built one at a time by hand. We figure that from the beginning to the end, they certainly built less than 100 bikes. 5 of them are known today. I showed you 2 of them in that first slide. So the question always becomes, what was the link between the fact that they were bike mechanics and the invention of the airplane? I mean, it had to be more substantial than simply the fact that they were in the bike business. I mean, if bike mechanics, bike builders were going to invent the airplane, it would have happened a long time before Wilbur and Orville Wright. What they brought to it, as we'll see, was uniquely their own. But it's also important to recognize that people at the time saw a link between cycling and flying. I'm going to read something here to you that was written by a fellow named James Means, who wrote about aeronautics in the last decade of the 19th century. And this was from his Aeronautical Annual, which was published in 1896. And he says, and I'm quoting, "It's not uncommon for the cyclist in the first flash of enthusiasm, which quickly follows the unpleasantness of taming the steel steed, to remark, wheeling is just like flying. To learn to wheel, one must learn to balance. To learn to fly, one must learn to balance." And he's not the only one who sees this sort of intellectual link between cycling and flying. Otto Lilienthal, who was the most important of the Wright brothers' predecessors in aeronautics, once said, and he wasn't a bike builder, he was a mechanical engineer, but he once said that he thought when the airplane finally came to pass, he thought it would likely be the work of bicycle builders. And so it's worth asking, why was that the case? Well, I mean, bike technology, like airplane technology at the time, is lightweight stuff, lightweight metal, wood, chains, sprockets, those kinds of things. But what Means was pointing to, to learn to bike, one must learn to balance. To learn to fly, one must learn to balance, was the real link between cycling and the invention of the airplane. And the real reason why people like Otto Lilienthal thought that the airplane would grow out of cycling, the result of the work of cyclists. And it's why you can kind of get a notion in these pictures that I'm showing now. Controlling a bicycle, once you internalize it, I mean, it becomes automatic, as we always say, once you've done it, you never forget it. But in fact, when you think about what you internalize learning to ride a bike, it's pretty astounding. If I were trying to describe riding a bike to a Martian or someone who had never seen a bicycle, it would be, what? You want me to roll downhill on these two rubber things, and there are these pedals I have to operate, and handlebars, okay, and I have to balance it from side. It would sound as though you had to be the world's greatest acrobat to ride a bike. The Wrights realized that once you internalize it, you had it. It was going to become automatic, part of you, part of your thinking, your mechanism. At the time, most people who were trying to invent the airplane failed to see that. To people like Samuel Langley, who was the third secretary of the Smithsonian, for example, he thought that, when you think about flying an airplane, gosh, the thing will be like something balanced on the head of a pin, can move in any direction in any second, and nobody is going to be able to control all of that. So we have to make this airplane thing inherently stable. It has to fly forward in a straight line, same altitude, until the pilot tells it to change direction or change altitude. He was convinced that you had to have automatic stability, inherent stability in the airplane. Wilbur and Orville, as cyclists who had really realized something that not many of us who ride cycles recognize, how complex the notion of controlling a bicycle is, and how you're dealing with several axes of motion. You're dealing with the roll axis, you're dealing with the yaw axis, wheel right, wheel left, and you have to coordinate those sort of between your ears, as it were. And so they realized that, gosh, once you do that, you've got it. You're not going to forget it. And therefore, we can build an airplane that can be completely controlled by the pilot the whole time. And it turned out that was the key to the invention of the airplane, at least the first key. Now, at the time, there were people, this is that guy Otto Lilienthal I told you about, who was convinced that cyclists were going to invent the airplane. Here he is gliding down a hill in Germany. You couldn't look at pictures like this at the turn of the century or before the turn of the century and not recognize that the world was close to a flying machine. Well, on August 9th, 1896, he was killed doing exactly what you see on the screen. He was killed in a glider crash. Orville was suffering from about a typhoid fever, and he was actually on kind of a cot in the back room of the bicycle shop. And Wilbur would sit by him reading the newspapers and keeping him entertained. And it was in August 1896 that Wilbur read an article about the death of Otto Lilienthal. And it occurred to him that, okay, the great Lilienthal is dead. Who's going to pick up his gauntlet? Maybe my brother and I can contribute something here. Wilbur at the time is approaching 30. He's living in his father's house, not married, running a small, very small business, the bike shop, with his brother. He looks around and the people he went to high school with, starting families, doing well in business. What's he done? So, in fact, Wilbur Wright is literally looking around for a way in which to prove his own value to himself, if no one else. And the challenge that he finds is the invention of the airplane. Octave Chanute, a friend of theirs, who's also practicing with gliders. And you can see how that works. The first problem the Wrights had, if you look at Otto Lilienthal or Octave Chanute here, how are these guys controlling the gliders? Well, you can see it's by body shifting. That's the only control this guy has over his machine. And that means the machine's got to be fairly small. If it's got a big wingspan, you aren't going to be able to change the center of gravity of the thing enough to control it. So it's got to be fairly small. The Wright brothers, being the Wright brothers, when we think about the Wrights, we do tend to think of them as bike mechanics. And there's a sense in which that's unfortunate, because in fact, what these guys are, as time will demonstrate, they are engineers of genius. At the time, most engineers in the United States and in Europe, for that matter, weren't college graduates. They were people who had learned engineering on the job, working, designing canals, designing railroads, this thing or the other. And that's the way the Wright brothers came to it. Their mathematical skills, they didn't have calculus, but they did have algebra and advanced geometry. And that was enough to start them down the correct road. And what they did when they first came to the problem, you can see the little inner tube boxes up here and how you can change the angle of the thing by twisting the box with your fingers. If you look at this image of the 1902, you can see that the wings on the left are warped down. The ones on the right are warped up. Wing warping is the term that they gave to this process of controlling the airplane in roll by being able to change the angle of attack on either side of the wings, right or left. And you did that, in fact, by shifting your weight. There were lines from the pilot's position leading out to the wingtips, so that just by shifting his hips, he could put a helical twist across the top and bottom of the wing. It's a biplane, because they recognized that structurally that was the only way to go. With these thin wings that people were flying with at the time, they have almost no strength in torsion. But if you add struts and wires, you turn those thin wings into a single beam. And it's a beam structure that, again, you can manipulate the geometry of the thing to control it. And that's the key to the Wright brothers. They start with a little kite that you can see here. And you can see in the image with the letters and numbers how their wing warping system works to control, again, an airplane in roll and yaw. Once they had done that, bike shops, this is the one at 127 West 3rd, where they were when they built the world's first airplane. And the pictures over here are on the right, are the back side of the bike shop, where they actually did machining and aircraft building and that kind of thing. The Wright brothers, once they had the control thing in mind, they next had to try to actually design a full-scale machine. And to do that, they used an existing algebraic formula they got from Otto Lilienthal. You could plug certain specifics in and calculate the amount of wing area that was going to be required to lift the weight of the glider and the weight of the pilot into the air. And it turned out you had to build a pretty big airplane, or you had to find a place where you could fly into a headwind, in which case, of course, your airspeed becomes the combination of the speed of the wind you're flying into and your own ground speed. And they wrote to the Weather Bureau in 1900 and asking for windy places in the United States. And it turns out that the windiest places really were, as you would suspect, cities on lakes like Chicago, or on the ocean like San Francisco. But looking at this list of wind speeds that the Weather Bureau sent them, about 6 places down on the list was this tiny little place on the North Carolina coast called Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Almost nobody ever went there. If you were looking for an isolated place on the Atlantic coast in 1900, Kitty Hawk better be on your list. The Wright brothers didn't want a lot of people around to see what they were doing. They wanted wind. They loved the notion of dunes that they could fly from, because one of their other key decisions was that, like Lilienthal and like Chanute, they were going to fly gliders so that they would learn to fly as they were unlocking the secrets of flight. And this is a picture of what that section of the Outer Banks of North Carolina looked like in 1900. When you visit Wright Brothers National Memorial today, it doesn't look anything like that. Lots of grass and all that. Somebody once asked Orville Wright what Kitty Hawk was like when they first went there. And his answer was, it was like the Sahara, or the Sahara as he imagined it to be. They took this machine, their 1900 machine, down in 1900. And you can see they're flying, you can see the lines here. They're flying it as a kite. That's because when they got down there, again, they have calculated the wing area that they needed to lift the weight of the glider and the pilot. Well, when they got down there and actually tried the thing, they discovered that they were way short of lift, about 20% less lift in reality than what they had calculated. Well, that meant there was a problem with the calculation someplace. And I think a lot of folks probably would have thrown this thing in the sand and gone fishing when they discovered it really wasn't big enough to actually learn to fly on. The Wright brothers, being the Wright brothers, said, well, okay, it's not giving us the lift we want. How much lift is it generating? You can see these lines, kite lines. One of them goes down to a fish scale. so that they can get the total force operating on the glider. They have a way to calculate the angle of attack that it's flying at naturally, and they have a gorgeous anemometer to measure the wind speed. And with those things, with the wind speed, the angle of attack, and the known size and so on and so forth, they could back calculate lift. And that's how they discovered they were getting about 20% less than what they had calculated. They actually did try to make glides on it. Wilbur made a couple of glides just before they started back to Dayton. When these guys go to Kitty Hawk, you have to remember they're on vacation from the bike shop. So they're down there for a few weeks and test their machine and come back. They went back to Dayton, back to building and selling bikes, and they came back down in July and August, which is a funny time for bike shop owners to go on vacation, but they did. And they brought a second machine. This is their 1901 glider. And you can see they're still flying it as a kite to get the data that they need to discover what their problem is with lift. But this machine, they had built about twice the size of the 1900 machine. So they figured they could at least make some flights with it, and they did. And here's Wilbur flying the 1901 machine at Kitty Hawk. And you can see up on top roughly how many flights they made that year. He's laying on the machine, of course, to reduce the drag. And the thing in front of him is the canard elevator that he can maneuver to climb or descend. They still were getting less lift than they calculated. It was enough to actually begin flying, and that became a problem because once they actually were in the air trying this thing, they discovered a control problem that they hadn't suspected. But the big problem was still this fact that they weren't getting the lift that their calculations predicted. There had to be something wrong with the calculation. They were using design data that they had inherited from Otto Lilienthal, that German. So they decided the only thing they could do when they got back to Dayton in the fall of 1901 was to throw out Lilienthal's data and begin to gather their own aerodynamic data. The first thing they wanted to do was make sure that that original algebraic formula was incorrect. And so what they did was to take a Wright bike. They put a freewheeling wheel up here in front of the handlebars. You can see two little surfaces. One of those is a flat plate. The other one is a cambered airfoil. And they had designed this thing on the basis of the formula. So they ought to be able to ride this thing down the street and the two surfaces would balance one another. Well, they didn't. As they rode through the street, the wheel turned. So there had to be a problem. And they discovered the solution to the problem with this. Isn't a very clear shot. This is their 1901 wind tunnel. You can see it's actually nothing but a box, like a coffin, with a fan here on the other end. The real heart and soul of the wind tunnel is this thing. It's an engineering balance that you put inside the wind tunnel. And when you turn the wind tunnel on, this tall vertical thing that you see here on top is a model airfoil. This whole device that you see, you can hold in the palm of your hand. It's quite small. It's made out of bicycle spoke wire. You can see bent hacksaw blades, and you can see a quadrant down here. What happens is when you turn the wind tunnel on, you can begin to actually measure the amount of lift or drag that you're getting on a particular surface. And they use this is the lift balance. You had to have another balance to measure drag or air resistance. And using these little devices in mostly November and December of 1901, they were able to create a whole table of coefficients of lift and drag that solved the problem that they had had with the old Lilienthal data. So when they went back to Kitty Hawk in 1902, they went with this craft, the 1902 airplane. In fact, this is the world's first airplane, even though it's unpowered. It was the first time that they had valid aerodynamic data. The thing could be now controlled. You can see that they've added a rudder back here to the back of the airplane. And again, they still have the elevator in front. So now they have 3-axis control in roll, yaw, and pitch, really for the first time. And it's just an extraordinary machine. The Wright brothers, when it came time to patent the airplane, didn't patent the powered airplane. They patented the glider because they weren't inventing an internal combustion engine. They were inventing a flying machine. And they could demonstrate their principles to the patent examiner more clearly if they just ignored the engine and focused on the control system. You can see, I love this picture. You can see what Kitty Hawk really looked like, those of you who know what it's like today. And those 2 little sheds you can see just in the lower center, those are the sheds where they lived and where they stored the 1902. So with that done, they went back to Dayton. They now have aerodynamic and control data. The last problem they have to solve is propulsion. And they build their own engine. Their bike mechanic, Charlie Taylor, in the bike shop, actually builds this engine with the help of a foundry in Dayton. The really tough part wasn't the engine. The engine that powered the world's first airplane that you see here only developed about 12.5 horsepower for an all-up weight of about 200 pounds. But again, because these guys were engineered who calculated everything they could, they had carefully designed, the propellers were among the toughest technical problems that they faced in the invention. They were the first ones really who recognized that, in fact, propellers are nothing more than rotary wings. Instead of giving you lift that'll get you off the ground, they give you propulsion that will move you forward. And to design these real propellers so that they could calculate exactly how much thrust and whether they were actually going to be able to fly before they did it, they had to use their wind tunnel data they knew the propellers would be turning at a different speed all the way along the blade. And so they picked the airfoil data, excuse me, for that condition and did their props. And what you see is what you would have seen if you'd been at Kitty Hawk on December 17th, 1903 at about 10:35 in the morning. It's Orville on the machine and Wilbur's over here, a wing walker beside him. And there they go, the world's first controlled, powered, sustained flight in a heavier than air machine. And of course, it's not the end of the Wright story. They made 4 flights that day. This picture was taken close to the end of the 3rd flight. And here you can see the first 3 flights. First one's only 120, 175, 200. The last 4th flight of the day was 852 feet, and Wilbur, in that case, kept it in the air for 59 seconds, almost a minute. The airplane was damaged by the wind on the ground after it after it landed, not in the air. So those 4 flights were the only flights that the world's first airplane was going to make. That's a picture taken on one of those later flights. They, instead of continuing to spend money to go down to Kitty Hawk, once they had basic success, they decided to find a place in Dayton where they could continue their work. Huffman Prairie, as you can see, it's a cow pasture about 8 miles east of Dayton. And they built this machine in 1904. These are all 1904 pictures. And they built a second machine, the 1905 Flyer, in 1905. And by the end of the 1905 flying season, they were capable of remaining in the air, flying well over 20 miles, remaining in the air until the gas and oil ran out. And so they had gone from the success of 1903 to the reality of a practical airplane by the fall of 1905. The 1903 airplane, of course, is in our museum, the National Air and Space Museum today. This airplane, the 1905, the world's first practical airplane, is in Caroline Park in Dayton today, which is part of Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park. So there you go. The Wilbur and Orville Wright moving from the lessons they learned riding and building bikes and thinking about the physics of bicycling to the invention of the practical airplane. And I love this picture. You can see in the back, this is the modern picture taken at Dayton Aviation Heritage National Park. And you can see the building in the back is the Wright Cycle Company that they were in 1896 when they began their experimental work. And the little girl dancing around is my granddaughter. So I end a lot of talks with a picture of my granddaughter dancing in front of the Wright Cycle Company. So, questions?
Well, Tom, that's phenomenal. This is Bob again, and we've had a couple questions from our friend John Whitehead out there. And in seeing those pictures of Kitty Hawk, we assume they traveled with all of their equipment and materials by rail. And did they have local helpers out there when they were building the shed?
They did indeed travel by rail. They started out in Union Station in Dayton. They had to take one train to Cincinnati, and they transferred there to a train that would take them all the way to the East Coast to Hampton Roads, Virginia. They had to take a steamer, and they're carrying the wood and the fabric for the airplane and all of that across Hampton Roads to Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And once they got in Elizabeth City, they had to find somebody with a boat. In the first year that Orville went, or Wilbur went, 1900, he had a terrible time even finding anybody in Elizabeth City who knew where Kitty Hawk was. But he finally found a guy with a pretty decrepit boat that took him across Albemarle Sound to Kitty Hawk. So that was a trip, that they had to make every time. And in fact, in 1903, their problem wasn't with the engine or with the airframe, it was with their transmission. The reason they were there so long in 1903 is because they were determined to make that first flight. But the prop shafts kept bending, and Orville actually had to make 2 rail trips back to Dayton to get new beefed up prop shafts and take the train back to Kitty Hawk and across the water and reinstall them. And so, yeah, it was quite a trip. The Wrights were not world travelers at this point. They became world travelers. They had gone to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in the 1890s. But other than that, this trip to Kitty Hawk was the first long trip they had ever taken. And when they got there, originally, I talked about Wilbur writing to the Weather Bureau, and they sent him a list of windy places, and he was intrigued by this Kitty Hawk place. And he sent a note to the guy who was in charge of the weather station at Kitty Hawk, a guy named Joe Dosher, who, spent about 10 minutes a day on the weather service and the rest of the time fishing. And Wilbur asked him if the winds were right and so on. And Joe Dosher sent him a short note back saying, all that's true. But he gave Wilbur's letter to a guy named Bill Tate, who was sort of the local factotum, and such there was in Kitty Hawk at the time. And Bill Tate wrote Wilbur a really nice note saying, yeah, we have those winds you're talking about, and we got these sand dunes that you could do your scientific kite flying from. But he closed it by saying, if you come among us, you will find friends who will help. And in fact, they did. So, maneuvering, especially the powered airplane in 1903, was not something two guys could do very easily. So they would hire one or two folks from Kitty Hawk Village. And as time went on, they made friends with the life-saving service guys down on the beach. In those days, in the fall, winter, and spring along the Outer Banks, there were life-saving stations about every 10 miles for the hurricane season. And, when there's no hurricane, these guys don't have a lot to do. So Wilbur and Orville, they would tack a red blanket up on the side of their shed. And the guys, the lifesavers down on the beach would see it and traipse up the beach to help out. So, yeah, they had a lot of volunteer help. As I said, the last flight of December 17th, 1903, they flew 852 feet down the beach. So what they had to do was, with their friends, there were 5 other guys there that day, volunteers, other than Wilbur and Orville. So they carried the airplane back up the beach, almost 900 feet, and it was really cold that day. And so they went into the shed. They had a carbide can stove in the shed to warm their hands up. But they had asked one guy, fellow named John T. Daniels. When they got there that day, Orville, who was a photographer, had set the camera up, pointed where he thought the airplane might leave the rail. And when Jack Daniels came up, he said, Jack, here's the bulb. If anything interesting happens, squeeze the bulb. And he did. And he took one of the most famous photographs ever taken, which he later claimed was the first photograph he'd ever taken. But when they brought the airplane back up at the end of that 4th flight, and then the wind was really gusting, they went in to warm their hands up. They asked Daniels to stay outside and kind of hold on to the airplane. Well, a gust of wind came along and toppled it over backwards, and Daniels went with it. He wasn't hurt, but he dined out. It's a true story. He dined out for 30 years after that by explaining to people that he had witnessed the world's first airplane flight. He had taken the first picture of an airplane in flight, and he'd been the first victim of an airplane accident all in one morning. So,
great story. We have 2 quick questions as we kind of wrap it up. You mentioned Charlie Taylor and the 1903 Flyers motor. How was it made? Did they invent something? And they obviously had to make it light, but a 12.5 horsepower engine that was created for the first biplane. How did that come about?
The engine was, as we say, not much to write home to mother about. Um, Again, as I've said repeatedly, these guys were engineers. They calculated everything. So Orville had sort of designed this engine, and Charlie built it just using the machine tools in the bike shop, a drill press, a lathe, and so on and so forth. They found a foundry in Dayton. The Wrights wanted to use an aluminum engine block, and they found a foundry in Dayton that was actually working with aluminum, which was pretty rare in 1902, 1903. But they provided the block, and Charlie put the rest of it together. The first engine that they made actually blew up. When you look at the airplane, if you look at this picture, in the center of the airplane, you can see that slightly thicker black line. That is essentially a water standpipe. When people look at the real first airplane, they assume it's a radiator, but in fact, there's no water pump on the engine. So the minute you start this engine up, any liquid that's in the engine is going to be turned into steam and driven out. So the only cooling you have on this engine, and it's not going to be much, is the cooling you get passing through the air. So the thing would just get really cherry red. And the only thing the standpipe does is when you're back on the ground and turn the engine off, and water can flow back into the engine block, I guess it'll cool it off a little sooner than it might have otherwise. But yeah, Charlie deserves a ton of credit for building the engine, not only the engine that built the first airplane, but the engine that powered the 1904 and 1905 airplanes. And once the Wrights founded their own company, Charlie became the head of the engine department and so on.
Great. Paul Chapman says that the Wrights actually pulled together a lot of things that other people invented. Is that true? As kind of a systems integration, and were there some things that they created that had never been done before?
Well, I mean, they created an airplane, and that had never been done before. But I mean, as Isaac Newton said, if I can see farther, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And that was true of Wilbur and Orville too. They took the last 3 or 4 giant steps toward the invention of the airplane. And I mean, to do that, they had to solve more technical problems than, say, Edison did in the invention of the light bulb, or Bell in the invention of the telephone. These guys, I mean, this is an airplane that has to lift itself off the ground and be controlled. It's just an extraordinary achievement. But yeah, of course, they're standing on the shoulders of the people who came before them. It's interesting. Human beings have wanted to fly literally for millennia. It's probably innate in human beings, a desire to fly. But the awful truth is that nothing technical in terms of the invention of the airplane happened before the year 1800. The invention of the airplane occurred essentially between 1800 and 1903. But a string of engineers in those years leading up to Wilbur and Orville Wright, certainly contributed. When you look at the airplane, for example, one of the key things that we tend to forget is that structure, this beam structure. Other people built airplanes that simply literally fell apart in the air in the case of Samuel Langley. The Wright brothers, starting with Octave Chanute and going back to an Australian, Lawrence Hargrave, who was fiddling around with beam designs for wings for airplanes. So, I mean, you can see the progression there. In other areas, propeller research, for example, because the Wrights were the only ones who had solid aerodynamic data that they had collected with the wind tunnel. Their propellers just stood alone. People often ask me, if Wilbur and Orville hadn't done it, who would have invented the airplane? And it's a hard question to answer because the people who came after them were inspired by them. The first European airplanes to fly in 1906 and 1907 don't necessarily look like the Wright Flyer, but they were braced biplane pusher, that is, props in the back pushing the airplane forward. Canard, that means the elevators in front, just like the 1903 Flyer. Now, I mean, that's not the most obvious configuration for a flying machine. So why did the early flying machines all look like that? Mostly it's because they knew what the Wright airplane looked like and they followed down the same path. So Santos Dumont, for example, in 1906, and the Voisin brothers and so on, the next year and moving forward. There were people like Louis Blériot who from the outset built monoplanes rather than biplanes. But even Blériot was influenced by the Wright's control philosophy, which was the core of what they achieved. And when it comes to flight control, they were, in that one area, they were pretty much by themselves.
Yeah. So if I can get you to kind of flip your screens all the way toward the end as we wrap up here. Like I said, we will be posting this Tireside chat. And I think the last few screens, and obviously there are many stories that Tom has researched. You can see some of his books there on the screen right now that he has either written or contributed to. Fascinating work, and he's actually working on a new book about the cultural history of the Smithsonian.
Right.
So we look forward to that. And you know, the fact is that we appreciate the folks tuning in today and others on down the line, and that the research still continues. And we're so appreciative and honored that you spent this time with us as part of the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame Tireside Chats, especially kind of teasing out the engineering of the bike influence on the airplane. And so we very much appreciate that. And thanks to everybody for your questions. And we'll see you on down the line with Tireside Chats in the future. And thank you, Tom. Thank you to our participants. And we appreciate the support of the U.S. Bicycling Hall of Fame. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.